Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Jordan Hall, a tech entrepreneur, philosopher, and metasystemic thinker who over a year ago announced that he's converted to Christianity. The following conversation was a live session during Limicon, a digital conference for people in the liminal, metamodern, and game B spaces. In it, we explored Jordan's past experiences with religion and spirituality and what ultimately brought him to Christianity. We also explored what Christianity might afford that Eastern spiritual traditions don't, and what role does religion play in ameliorating some of the negative trends in society and the meta crisis at large. Our dialogue was followed by a Q&A where participants asked many thought-provoking and soul-deepening questions. Enjoy. Jordan Hall, thanks so much for being here for this session. So I just want to set a bit of context before we dive in to this dialogue. And I've been following your work for years, and I really appreciate the richness and depth of perspective you bring on many topics. You're also not just an intellectual, but you're someone who has real-world experience engaging and seeing great success in business and entrepreneurial ventures. My sense is also you're someone who operates from a high level of integrity. So with all that said, I was surprised, like many others, when last year you announced that you've decided to convert to Christianity. My initial thought was, what brings a deep metasystemic thinker such as Jordan to enter into a religious tradition? And, I want to give a little bit more information, I want to say a little more of how I've been orienting to religion. I think for a long time, I held a very primitive understanding of religion, seeing it in something like a dogmatic doctrine, which is a common understanding for a lot of people. And then I came across Jordan Peterson and particularly his book, Maps of Meaning, which made me realize that the phenomenon of religion has far more depth and complexity than I initially realized. So I've grown increasingly curious about religion and religiosity, and the tradition I've been most engaged with over the years is Buddhism, although I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Buddhist. And sometimes I wonder if there is something that's afforded in identifying or seeing oneself as Buddhist or as Christian, rather than just engaging in certain practices or studying the teachings. So maybe that's a question we can come back to. But first, I'd love to hear about your history with religion and spirituality. Was there a religious tradition you grew up with? Have you studied or practiced with any other traditions throughout your life? And what is it that you feel made you gravitate and ultimately land in Christianity?
Mm-hmm. So the first question is no. I was not raised in any religious tradition. My mom was sort of maximally Reformed Jew, so I have a little bit of Yiddish, and I did Passover twice, I think, and we did some dreidel stuff. Still do. My dad was a reluctantly raised Catholic and left that, I think, as soon as he left his mother's house. And so the concept of religion that I received, I think sounds like it was kind of similar to yours. And so, okay, so that's that. That was the context. And I should mention, by the way, that I was definitely never an atheist, because when I thought about the question of atheism, what seemed pretty clear is that it's actually not a logically coherent position to take. But I did articulate myself as an agnostic. I mean, we're talking even like 14, 15. That was okay, that's where I am. And maybe the key thing was something like agnostic and not particularly concerned with that category. So something like it is reasonable, appropriate, maybe even necessary, maybe even something like virtuous, to not really worry about that. That's more of maybe it's a hobby. People can participate in that as a hobby, or it's a way that they deal with their own things, but it's not an important part of reality. And so then, maybe the next step is to just talk about this notion of metasystemic thinking, that with an adequate amount, let's say, of metasystemic thinking, you begin to realize that presumption of the meaning and place of religion is wrong. kind of as simple as that. Um, and quite radically wrong. And in some sense, once you get to it, you begin to realize how silly wrong it is, because there's a natural stack. And you can just think about it in terms of the kinds of questions that are asked. So, for example, I remember when I came into college, I think I was doing computer science and economics initially. But what I noticed was that the kinds of questions that were allowed to be asked within those particular disciplines were interesting. But when I started asking more profound questions, the response was, that's not a question we ask in this discipline. So I'm like, well, who does? Eventually I ended up in philosophy, right? Where you're, at least within the Western tradition, you're allowed to ask the deepest questions. Well, as it turns out, if you keep going down that path, you'll actually find yourself in religion, because religion is not where you ask the deepest questions. It's where you participate in the deepest life, which is a deeper place than asking questions. And here we now fortunately have the advantage of kind of the Vervaeke corpus, and you can really talk about the difference between propositions and participatory. And so as you move from a propositional domain and you move into a participatory domain, you're moving from a place where philosophy is very comfortable down into the category that will ultimately be religion, and by the way, spirituality. We can make that distinction. Those are not exactly the same. In fact, they're meaningfully different. Okay, so when I got to that point, and I got to that point roughly in when was that? 2014. This then raises the problem, which is an interesting triple problem of, and you, as you posed it, what is religion? What is spirituality? How are they related? How are they distinct? And to the degree to which one ultimately cannot avoid being religious fundamentally. You can either be consciously religious or unconsciously religious, but you cannot avoid being religious. How does one actually begin to make choices to do that well? And that was, I guess we're at Limicon, aren't we? This is where the notion of liminality becomes the central point, because of course, if you are reserving some fundamental perspective from which to make that assessment, the thing that you're reserving is a religion. And so you're already importing, usually unconsciously, a series of primary values and purposes that are conditioning the answers that you're making to those questions. Or you have to actually enter into a truly liminal state. From a truly liminal state, you begin the walk, no longer guided by your own understanding, but by direct relationship with experience in life, and begin to see what happens. So in that case, I did. And I would say I had more at the level of like how would you say it, an affair with multiple different religions. A little bit stronger than a dalliance, but definitely not at the level of actual marriage, which I suppose is my character. So I spent time with the Buddhists, different flavors of Buddhism, mostly a little bit deeper in Zen and a little bit of maybe an ankle deep in Dzogchen. I spent time with, by the way, just it's important to notice that in the beginning, the ability to distinguish, say, Dzogchen from, do you guys know what the gene keys is? Anybody? And to distinguish between Dzogchen and the gene keys is impossible at zero in the liminal, because you have no basis upon which to distinguish them. So I actually went quite deep in the gene keys, because they happened to land in front of me, into tarot and astrology and esotericism, and I think largely because I had played D&D growing up, so those had an aesthetic resonance that hooked. I was like, yeah, okay, I can vibe with that. I get a sense of those sorts of things. I then started moving, let's say, in a more orderly fashion, into some of the more indigenous stuff. Well, maybe not that orderly. Initially, of course, this is mediated by the New Age medicine tribe, which are people who take drugs and wear feathers. But yes, so I did that. So I started doing things in the New Age domain with psilocybin. I'd already been an LSD guy, but did that a little bit. And then eventually landed on grandmother, on ayahuasca. And then that had a very profound impact. Like, okay, walking out of that, okay, the spiritual is real. That's not going to be a question anymore. That's to the degree to which I can articulate anything is real. That's real. And therefore I'm going to start interacting with that domain of the spirit, let's say, and with the various people who have experience in that. And so I walked down that path for a while, and that brought me into a lot of interesting experiences. Getting possessed, by the way, which my Zen Buddhist priest helped me work my way out of that one, which was, think about how cool that combo is. And traveled to interesting places. Mostly syncretic, though, right? Mostly there was this sense, I guess many people here are also very familiar with the integral movement. So mostly in a sense of postmodernity, of all of these lineages are interesting and many of them are very deep, but we're a lot smarter than that. So we need to figure out how to integrate the best and not deal with the bad. So what is a new thing that is a tighter, deeper, richer, more full integration of what has come before? And so this, generally speaking, ended up being some meaningful portion of indigenous wisdom, some meaningful portion of Eastern, and then some portion of esotericism, which was kind of the remainder from the West that we could play with. And by the way, remember, I guess I hadn't even said this, so I am remembering, all still in the context of the meta crisis. What brought me into this was being dragged kicking and screaming by the reality that we weren't going, one either needed to be remarkably irresponsible or straight up nihilistic, or endeavor to steer into the meta crisis and respond to it in some fashion. And then second, in order to respond to it in some fashion required this deep metasystemic thinking and rigorous. You can't just sort of, you can delude yourself, but at a certain point you begin to notice the lack of integrity, because that's not going to address the meta crisis. It's equivalent to narcissism or nihilism or just irresponsibility. And this then leads me over the threshold. Right? So remember, all of this is happening in that context. There's always a continuous response of, okay, how does this play a role in my/our collective response to the meta crisis? And that provided both a motivation to keep going into the crucible, because none of this was easy. All of it was actually rather harrowing. And also to do so in a fashion that was not individual, because it's obvious that the response to the meta crisis is corporate, right? It's us. And so I was, therefore, as a consequence, and I don't know if there's anything wise about this, I just happened to be not brought into a lot of the kind of the failure conditions or the seductions that can happen on the purely spiritual path, which I suppose I can expand on that if you'd like. And this kept drawing me towards the category of religion. And, so now we're kind of at the 2023 timeframe, really, where as a result of a failure of a series of very strong and intentional experiments, my family ended up, rootless, homeless, quasi-homeless at my parents' house in Texas, and going, okay, what next? And so we ended up coming here. And when we came here, all that had come before had the quite beautifully natural characteristic of clarifying and focusing like all the good parts actually got clarified, focused, and accentuated. And all of the bad parts, noticed just there was less attachment. And attachment meaning like they didn't grab a hold of me. So as an example, one of the things that I learned initially, I think mostly in Kauai, was how to come into relationship with a place, with the spirit of a place, and to inquire with the place of what your proper relationship with that place might be. And once that had sort of settled deeply in Kauai, I then noticed that was a continuous faculty, let's say, so that I would go to other places and begin to have a conversation with the place and notice whether or not I was invited to be there and under what circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So as I end up in Black Mountain, one of the things that happens is this faculty goes, whoa, this is a really good place for me. Like, I'm supposed to be here. I'm really supposed to, this place really wants me to be here. It is going to guide me. And I can sort of rest in that guidance, as an example. So that leads us up to kind of the doorway of Christianity. And maybe I'll pause right there.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate all those details. And one of the things you were saying that you were agnostic, and I remember also as a child, like one of my friend's fathers was asking me like, "Oh, what religion do you practice?" Or like, "Do you believe in God? Do you not believe in God?" And like that was the first time anybody asked me that. And then he kind of explained to me what atheism was and what agnosticism was, and I was like, "Oh yeah," I was like, "That one, agnosticism." Like I don't know, but I never had like this deep uh, thinking about it. Like, oh, atheism doesn't make sense. It was only later on that I actually thought about it in that way. But yeah, you mentioned like a lot of things. Really, like you've been around the block, and you've engaged with different traditions with Buddhism. You mentioned Dzogchen, Gene Keys. I was interesting to hear you say that tarot, astrology, all these things. Obviously, psychedelics. You've experimented with a lot of these things, landed in the integral metamodern space as well, and all of this is being held in the context of the meta crisis as all these issues are arising. And then you come to North Carolina and Black Mountain, and that's kind of where you left off. And I guess I'm curious then, like what, right? Because you mentioned that you come to this place, and it seems like all the good things become amplified, and kind of the bad things aren't sticking to you as much. But then how does Christianity play into that? How does that tradition end up playing into this place that you're now at?
Hmm. Nice. So, hmm. Well, I'm actually for a second, I'm going to back up a lot and then come back again. Because you mentioned that in the moment or the arc of life prior to where I began the story, which is to say prior to spirituality and religion, I had actually had a life, right? I had a life of specifically being a high-tech entrepreneur in the startup vernacular. And the thing I wanted to mention in that context was I learned how to cultivate instincts and how to trust intuitions. This is actually a very nice, and there's many. Being a special forces operator has a similar, different kind, but similar sense of training. Being a day trader, meaning context where the environment you're in is definitely more complex than any effort to map it and understand it analytically. It's moving faster and it's more complex. And yet your choices are forced. You constantly have to make choices, and the consequences of your choices have high stake and return to you quickly. So it's a very powerful learning domain. And so what happens is you learn, and everybody who's experienced any of these kinds of domains will tell you the same thing. You learn how to cultivate good instincts and good intuitions and learn how to navigate on that basis. Which doesn't mean, by the way, that you don't think about what's going on, but you notice that your thinking is integrated into a larger scheme. This is very important, FYI. This is just a little bit aside, but intuition and thinking do not sit next to each other. Thinking sits embedded in intuition. Intuition is a bigger thing that includes thinking in it. And so you cultivate and learn how to be comfortable. Like, hey, I'm going to be making a very important, this is a decision that's going to have tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of implications. I know for certain that I don't have anywhere near enough information, and yet it has to be made right now. All right, I'm going in. Right, that level of sensibility. Now, that same set of faculties, it was just now part of me. As I begin moving forward in life, what happens is the set of domains and qualities of experience that I'm cultivating these intuitions and instincts and continue to grow. Okay, so by the time, and by the way, inevitably on the basis of suffering, inevitably on the basis of undergoing and having to carry the burden of being off, being wrong, a wrong choice or a bad choice, and then cultivating something like more deeper wisdom in relationship with at least the things that you encountered. Or not, by the way, but if you do, then you're moving forward. So when I show up in Black Mountain, that's what's happening. Right? I've now gone through the arc of being an entrepreneur, and by the way, a kind of a complex systems science, meta theory, metasystemic type dude, and then went through this arc in the domain of spirituality and religion, and have reached a certain level of competency in navigating reality on that basis. And I was in a profoundly liminal state, like once again brought to actually to the deepest level of humility I've yet reached. So I come in going, I don't really have any idea how the world works or what I should be doing. So I'm just going to listen. Okay, so I start listening and I start noticing that things start showing up. And these things that show up have the signal characteristics of the what I would now call faith, right? The cultivated intuitions and instincts that I have the most confidence in. And I just start walking towards them. Like I say, okay, I'll say yes to that. Say yes to that. I mean, the story that I have now told too many times online, but I'll just recapitulate very briefly here, is the first experience was we landed in Black Mountain and then we went to Asheville. And it was strategically, it seemed like Asheville was where were supposed to be, but intuitively, Black Mountain kept calling. So, you know what? Let's do Black Mountain. So we dive into Black Mountain. And the answer was, by the way, yes, that was a great choice. Later on, there's many more choices, by the way. So it's, continuous, like every day. Okay, good feedback. This place wants us to be here. The people want us to be here. We have some kind of role to play. Something's happening. This is not just a place to kind of store our carcass until we die. It's actually maybe the most meaningful thing and perfectly outside of our plans. And then we get invited to a children's birthday party, a 2-year-old who I don't know, of a family who I don't know. In fact, I don't know anybody except for the one person who invites me. And I don't know how they have authority to invite me, but it feels like, yeah, this is of that same fabric. It's not the kind of thing that my sense making would tell me be a right thing to do, but I'm just going to say yes. So we go. And one of the things that comes out of that is we get invited to go to this particular church. And in a beautiful way, like the invitation itself has how would you say, a context or a richness that just connects very deeply. It's like, okay. And weirdly enough, it was structured in such a way that my wife and daughter go to the church while I'm actually booked to be in San Francisco. And weirdly, because I hadn't been to San Francisco in 4 years or anywhere, like we've all been together. And so, okay, now we're apart. They go. My wife has a good experience, probably perfect, if you think about it. Because then when she reports back that she had a good experience, that just puts me in a place of almost receptivity. All right. I trust her instincts deeper than mine, honestly, and particularly in this category. I'll go in. So then we go. I go the next week. And what happens is, and I've been trying to figure out what's the right language to describe it. It's like, this is not perfect, but just remember that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. If you're old, you probably do. If you're not, you probably don't. But in that, there was these individuals, all these various people who had these weird visions, and they were obsessed by the visions, but they couldn't figure out what the vision was, and they kept trying to figure out how to articulate it. So one dude's like making it out of mashed potatoes, and like the female lead is trying to sketch it in watercolors that she's teaching herself. It's like and the point is, you're looking at it like, I don't have any idea what that is, but it's there, and then they finally find themselves drawn, by the way, by outside of their own understanding, to the Devil's Tower, ironically enough. And they look at it and they're like, oh shit, that's what I was seeing all this time. And now it's in 3D, in full color. It's in reality. That was kind of the experience. Like I spent all this time really quite intensely and collaborating with lots of smart people and well-intentioned people on what does the response to the meta crisis look like. And I have a, really robust theory of what it needs to look like. And so I'm sitting here in this very unassuming, you've been there, Terry, simple country church in Swannanoa, which is itself a very unassuming town in Western North Carolina, which is a very unassuming region. And I'm watching these folks do something which has been part of a basic tradition for hundreds of years here and thousands of years in the world. I'm looking around going, holy shit, that's the thing. This is actually the thing. In the right order, which was psychedelic, actually, to be perfectly frank. Like a feeling of, holy cow, wow, like I felt stirred up and things began to actually get very, very crystal clear. So then, by the way, I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to take off who I am. I need to make sense of what's going on here. Like, is this real, or am I just, dropping into something? And so we continued going to that church for probably about 6 weeks, I'm guessing. and then showing up on Wednesdays to house church, which, by the way, is irreducible. You go to church, just one thing on Sunday. You go to house church on Wednesday or Thursday, and oh yeah, of course, you need that too. Like these are part of the core constructs of the base code that enables any kind of culture to actually have integrity. Um, Neat. They're already doing it. How do I participate? And without any notion of like leading or knowing or anything like that, but actually just what's my invitation to participate? And then, about 6 weeks in, I'm both my wife and I both have a conversation. We're troubled because it really is the thing, I think in terms of participatory knowing, that almost all of ourselves wants to keep doing. Like Sunday is my favorite day of the week. I want to keep participating, but my mind and my integrity go, well, yeah, but I can't if I'm actually not in integrity. Like if I don't actually have the ability to believe that what is being said here is in fact true, then that would just be very false, and I would probably end up undermining the goodness of what's happening here by something going on. I would either try to own it and kind of reframe it, or carve out a little sub territory that's my own sort of version of what's happening or whatever. And so I dove in, right? And so I did a massive amount of research. The most intense experience of research, of effort that I've had, at least in 20 years, probably more. Highly compressed and all consuming. And it was fun, actually, because it was something was going on that was allowing me to have that level of energy. I mean, I read, I don't even know how much, so much, and watched so many videos and did so much thinking and talked to so many people. And what happened is I came out the other end with a deeper level of humility in particular, and an awareness of, man, oh man, did I have a lot of basic ideas just wrong. Like the idea of faith, completely wrong. The idea of religion, wrong. The idea of what the crucifixion and this crucifixion narrative is and what it's about, very, very wrong. The notion of the Trinity, wrong, which I've talked about ad nauseum. So the humility was, man, I was wrong about these things. I don't mean just like, how do you say it right? A little bit wrong, but rather naive and adolescent, even petulant, holding the most meaningful things as if I understood them, without having even truly attended to them at all properly. It's that showing up, which is interesting. I mean, in the indigenous sense, you learn the wrongness of that very quickly. Like, what are you doing showing up at the sacred mountain, not even knowing that it's a sacred mountain? Whoa, you're a Holly. You can't understand. You're not listening at all. All right, well, same thing here. What am I doing thinking I know what faith is and then presuming to reject something on the basis of a completely inadequate effort to even understand? And so as through that process, I come to the presence, like the flip, the movement of from truth as semantic content, propositions that are understood, to truth as participatory relationship, for example, and into really having the profound feeling of being swept along, being brought into, and the being brought into having, how do you say it right? Man, all I can say is like all the right characteristics. I'll give you an example. Who here is familiar with the concept of we space? A few we spacers? Yeah. Or what we might call collective consciousness or Sangha. There's variations on the theme that different lineages talk about. But okay, so I had actually gone pretty deep in we space because it turns out you need something like that to navigate the meaning crisis. So, okay, fine. I'm using we space faculties, techniques, and oh, whoa. We is actually rather big. We is not the seven people sitting in this circle. We is, in fact, the infinite. And the infinite is not a neutral, how do you say, content-free abstraction. The infinite, in fact, is the exact inverse of that. The infinite is personhood, qua personhood, for example. So all of these different things keep being brought to a higher tone. Like, oh, I'm doing we space, but now I'm doing it in a fashion which is both what it's kind of supposed to be done, why it's a thing at all, and in the right fashion. Neat. And And I'll give you one more point, and then I'll stop talking again. One of the things I noticed during some of the early sermons that I listened to, which is, we have many pastors, pastors giving sermons, was, well, actually several. One was I really appreciated the wholesomeness in the sense of he would move through a sermon. It would go into high theology and then drop down talking about SEC basketball, but maintaining continuity in between. In other words, the analogy of SEC basketball contained the key insights of the high theology very well. So I could appreciate all of that, which is to say that he's speaking to everybody. It's an actual, it's a community. He's speaking to the people in this community, and he's carefully endeavoring to speak properly and honestly so that everybody can participate. But the theology is very good. That's one. Two, as he's doing this, I have a couple of encounters where he says something, and I have what I learned from Benito Roy was what you call it, reaction. In other words, like I did this. Right? Oh, I don't like that. Right? Some contraction. Some part of me actually hardens against it. But I'm in this context, and I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And so I inquire, and around about my heart, I get this experience, and it basically says, "You didn't like that, and that's because you're wrong." Like, oh shit, that was like, in half a second, and that I'm wrong somehow is being able to be held in a space of, yeah, you're right. I was wrong. All right. I'm not doing that anymore. That's how I understand the meaning of the term conviction in at least the Protestant branch. I think that's mostly right, but I think a lot of people use it differently. So FYI. Yeah, so I kept having this experience of being convicted, which deepens humility, by the way, and allowed me to begin to notice what exactly is happening here in a better fashion, because I'm here in some sense now to receive a truth, like a relationship with truth that is vastly deeper, vastly deeper than anything I could ever have hoped to do, and yet simultaneously connects with the faculties that I have the most trust in first, and works it up from there. Okay.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed listening to that, and it really, you coming to this town does sound like a psychedelic trip in like the best possible way. And I appreciate you actually mentioning intuition and how that's primary to thinking, and how you've built up that intuition through entrepreneurship, and you've and philosophy and deep thinking and all this stuff that you've done throughout the years, and then you come here to this town. And one of the other things you said is that it was like engaging, coming to this church, it was illuminating your ignorance. Like it was showing you how you were ignorant in some way. That's one of the things that I've started to recognize, is that's, if there's anything that religion is doing, it's illuminating our higher ignorance and putting us in contact with mystery, which is very different than thinking about like there's belief systems, and these are the belief systems, and you have to follow these belief systems. But yeah, there's the thing that's interesting to me is, other than the fact that obviously you come to this town and there's many other things that are just work out, like fit into place, and then you happen to go to this church and it happens to be a Christian church and the tradition speaks to you. Wondering what, from your sense, you found that's different. What do you find that Christianity affords that, in your experience, Eastern religions do not?
Well, I'm going to answer this actually in two distinct ways. Why in the world did I even say it that way? Oh, because it came into my head in that order. I was going to say, why would I tell you I'm going to start with the second? Because by definition, if I start with the second, it's actually the first. But it came into my head in this order. So first, I'm in the West. I'm not in the East. And it's really not a real thing to try to be a kind of a lone ranger Buddhist in Arizona when you're not immersed in a culture that has fully integrated the implications, consequences, presuppositions, and axiology of Buddhism. It's like trying to learn Spanish all on your own and never speak with a Spanish speaker at all and say, yeah, I'm fluent in Spanish. No, you're not. You're not. You maybe can read Spanish books, right? And you maybe actually be able to hold a conversation, but there's going to be this experience when you actually encounter a real native Spanish speaker. They're going to kind of tilt your head and go like, what are you talking about? That makes no sense because, of course, everything ultimately at the end of the day is content and context. And the context of a religion is an entire world. And if you try to abstract the context of a religion into just the content and plant that in a different context, you're going to have a very hard time. Right? So that's one part of it. I'm in the West. In fact, I'm in Western North Carolina in the mountains. And I don't think this is in the least bit trivial. I think this is very important. And I should even mention deeper, not only am I in the West, I am a Westerner. If I trace my lineage back, I actually have a Judeo-Jewish lineage through my mom's line and a European lineage through my father's line and a Texas lineage in both, 6 generations. I broke that. I guess I'm disappointment to my ancestors. But and there's something about that too, right? Because your family language, right? The things that are laid down when you're 6 months old, 2 years old, that is very deep and much deeper than your cognitive capacity to be aware of what you're thinking is the kind of stuff that's been poured into you. You know, what is the simple things like how do you relate to nouns and verbs? Like what is your grammar? And which values are foregrounded and which values are backgrounded. Like these things are not trivial. They're a landscape. And on that landscape, there's a long history of things that are happening that we can't just in a modernist sensibility imagine that we can either think our way out of or pluck ourselves out of and select the particulars. And this is the kind of the modernist hubris deployed not in ecology, but in your individual self capacity. All right, the other side. In terms of content, the center, the absolute center of the way that Christ presents is agape, is love. And there's a lot of things to say about that. One of which is to say that there's a horizontality and a verticality to it, which is very important to me, and I think in general. The horizontality is that the very bread, right, the very wine of the agapic love that is present in the way of Christ is communion, which is to say communion with your neighbors. Right? It is a religion that it takes at its very heart. What is your relationship with the people around you, and how do you commit yourself at the level of the sacred to that relationship? And it is including. Right? This thing is your relationships with the people around you are not only important and rich, they are woven of the same fabric as the nature of the sacred in general. And then the vertical. Right? The vertical is I am in relationship with the infinite, and the infinite's character is agape. And I am therefore held by something which by its very nature seeks to love me completely and perfectly. Which means then, one, I can trust that relationship, and two, the character of that relationship has this beautiful consequence of holding and nurturing me, but also doing so on the basis of an expansion of my self. And the simple example is to the degree to which you are a parent and you are not a narcissist. One of the things that you notice is how much you love seeing your child be who they are, and how much you are overjoyed to witness them become more of who they are. Now, many people are bad parents, and most people these days are narcissists. So that's a less and less common experience. But the point is, for God, it's the essential experience. And so that's a very powerful place. And that this is, again, the practices are not, how do I say this right? So let's say you're praying, right? That's a practice. You're fasting, which I'm doing right now. That's a practice. You're singing together. That's a practice. You even do the liturgy or the Eucharist. That's a ritual, which is a kind of practice. None of those are the point, right? All of those are there to serve the point, which is to love God with all of your self and heart and will, and to love your neighbor. And so the practice of being in the way of Christ is that. And then all of the practices are scaffolding to support you in being able to do that. And then finally, you have the propositions, which are largely to be able to help people move towards that center. So, I mean, I can differentiate from other lineages and traditions. I'll give you an example. Actually, I'll do one. So, one of the biggest challenges with the indigenous wisdom traditions is that they are of necessity bound to the spirit of that people. And so, if you're with we'll just use the Polynesians. If you're with the Polynesians, their traditions are their traditions. Christ comes and says, this is actually for all the nations. All of the spirits, all the nations, all the spirits are integrated underneath me, actually, under the logos. And so, and quite practically, like if you look at Paul very specifically deals with this problem. Hey, Jews, you have taken what is effectively an indigenous orientation. You're a nation, and you've identified Yahweh as your tribal god. Just like the Greeks, right? The Athenians have identified Athena as their tribal god. And whatever the guys in Tyre have identified Baal as their tribal god. So that's sort of, you're in the same place. And I was like, no, that is not how this works anymore. The Gentiles are as much a part of this as you are. Completely different game. And one that can and does actually allow all to be brought into a proper relationship with each other horizontally and with the nature of reality, the personhood of God vertically. I could go on, but I think I've gone on a lot.
Yeah, there was a lot there. But I guess two things that kind of stood out for me is that one is, and I've heard this a lot, like if you're a Western mind, you're kind of a Western mind, and it's hard to override that, or in that way, it might be easier to understand or participate with Western traditions. And then the other thing you were saying is that from your experience, there was more of an emphasis on relationship, and it was your sense that Eastern religions were more isolating. It was more like, I'm just meditating by myself, and here I'm participating in truth with a community of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And to participate in a way where the actual lived suffering of other people is in fact your concern. And by the way, not to get rid of that suffering, but to relate to it in a fashion where we can collectively carry our individual and collective suffering in a way that reveals the meaningfulness of it and of life.
Yeah, I was listening to one of your podcasts. I don't remember which one it was. You were mentioning this aspect of how your understanding, I think it was with Jonathan Pageau and Vervaeke, it was talking about how it's not about Christianity is not about getting rid of your suffering. It's learning from it, growing through it, developing through it. I guess we're kind of getting close to the end of our dialogue because I want to give space to other people. And I'm thinking, I had a lot of questions, and I feel as you were speaking, there were more questions that were popping up. But I guess the question that I'll ask is, are there any particular negative trends that you see in society that are perhaps a breakdown of religious traditions? And do you see that deep engagement with religious traditions can ameliorate some of those trends? And kind of the follow-up is the question of metacrisis. And I think in your conversation with Vervaeke, he said that not everybody is going to become a Christian, right? So we need something that's going to unify us, that moves beyond particular traditions. It seems like that's the case. So yeah, maybe you could kind of speak to the more particular negative trends that you see religion can help. And then, yeah, what role can religion play in the metacrisis, if any?
Well, let's just do an example in the first. Well, actually, I'll do three. So categorically, the heart of the metacrisis is in fact a religious crisis. So that's a simple assertion. So it's not that it is part of it or influences it. It is in fact fundamentally at its very, you keep going down the stack. When you get to the bottom of the stack, you're like, oh, that's actually where it is. Which of course I could talk about ad nauseum, but I won't right now. So then the next one, let's take an example. You may have heard the phrase Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world, which we can now see in real time. It's called AI now, but it's always been basically the same thing. Well, that's an example of what happens when the mind is disconnected from the soul and yields the will on the basis of its own understanding. Okay, that's an example. And then the third. So this is another one. So Eric Weinstein, long ago, did a great thing for me, which is he just said, hey, in math, oftentimes we will just take a word and we'll append like a code to let everybody know that we're using it in a particular way. But he would say, like, I can't remember a word like faith. Let's say I'm saying faith. Like, for the moment, let's just call this J faith, Jordan's version of faith. And so I don't have to worry about whether I know what it means. I just need to now know that I have a pointer to something. I don't know exactly what it means and it's loaded. Okay. The reason why I'm saying that is I want to say, okay, I'm going to provide a J Christianity. And what I'll assert is that everyone is on their way to J Christianity. And all religions, to the degree to which they're heading towards the good, the beautiful, and the true, are going in that direction. And that, let's say, for example, Orthodoxy is on that mountain heading up in a certain direction, and Roman Catholicism is on that mountain heading up in that direction. If you're not part of the Christian subworld, you may or may not know that what I just said enraged two entire different groups of people because they have mutually excommunicated each other. So they would both say, no, we're Christianity. And the other guy is, in fact, not just not Christianity, but heresy. I'm saying, no, there's something going on here which is bigger than everything that humans have ever created. And we are all participating in that something that is bigger than anything we've ever created. And there is a directionality. And by the way, there's sort of minimum viable. So I'll give you an example. If you have a soul, and you know you have a soul, and you care, then you are in the direction of J Christianity. If you think you don't have a soul, or you actively endeavor to sell your soul, then you're heading away from it. J, just the letter J. Which is to say the version of Christianity that I'm currently articulating, or more specifically, just a kind, to mentally separate and say, oh, no, dude, I know what Christianity is. It's what this guy said in that book. No, what I'm saying is let's just tag something up here, which eventually we would be able to say by hypothesis, yeah, that's actually the thing. And notice that there are variations on the thing that we've gotten to thus far over the past 2,000 years, some of which are, let's say, closer, and some of which are further away, but none of which are there because there's quite a significant thing. And so then what happens is I can dispense with some, concerns. We can say, let's just have conversations about what does it mean for us to be in relationship with truth. I can say, hey, if you're living in a propositionally dominant life, no, you should be living in a participatory life. Oh, cool. That's neat. From my point of view, that's in fact fundamentally a Trinitarian insight. And it's if you're interested in that, I can talk to you about why that is, and maybe that it goes deeper. But if all that happens is you go, yeah, got it, and you flip, hallelujah, because we've radically changed the trajectory of the meaning crisis to the degree to which more people are actually living in relationship with truth. More people are actually living on the basis of love, and I mean this real love. So I'll just hit this last piece, and then I'll just respond to questions. Let's see. One of the most horrible things that we have done is created a simulacrum of love and replaced it for the real thing. So love, by its very nature, requires intimacy. If you do not have intimacy, you cannot, in fact, actually engage in the relationship of love in a meaningful way. You can have a subset of love. You can have compassion. You could have goodwill. Right? These are all kind of participants. But the more intimate your relationship, the more you're, in fact, actually engaging in love. What we have done, and largely because we live highly alienated, atomized, and interestingly enough, decontextualized lives, is we have taken things like sentimentality, the sense that I kind of really would be better if people who I've never met aren't, hungry. Yeah, that's true. That's like the thinnest possible layer of love imaginable. But since we haven't got anything better than that, we've actually reified that as the thing itself. It's like, no, no, no. What does it mean to actually become vulnerable enough to have an intimate relationship with somebody who's capable of having an actual intimate relationship with you? And commit to that and get there and notice the consequences of it and then let that spiral out from the center. I bring that up because that inversion, flipping from, what's a good word for it? Like a variation between virtue and virtue signaling and love. That's a critical element for restoring and responding to to the meta crisis.
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of things you said that stood out. The meta crisis being fundamentally a religious crisis, and also the piece about going from propositional to participatory knowing. And it's like this also makes me think about the left and right brain, the Ian McGilchrist, and like the left brain is it's all about propositions, and our society functions a lot from that kind of place. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more that I could ask, but I want to open the floor to all the lovely participants we have here today. Yeah, so if somebody has a question, you could raise your hand. I see that there's some stuff here in the chat, but maybe we'll go with raise hand. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. Go ahead, Ron. You could unmute, ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was hoping not to go first because this may be a bit out of order, but it kind of aligns with what you were saying, Jordan. Something I've been wondering about on this whole issue of what do the traditional religions and particularly Christianity afford, maybe the metamodern / liminal world, however we define that. I am often wondering about what it would say about families, children, marriage, etc. Because I know this is a heaping generality, but I find that it seems to be a missing component in those circles. Just one example of what we talk about the meta crisis, and I noticed that the demographic crisis, for example, is never included in talks about the meta crisis, which to me, at least, I have a bias that that's maybe about as high as you can go in terms of worldly meta crisis. And again, I know this is a generality, and there obviously are individual people in our communities that are raising children, have great relationships, et cetera. But it's not talked about. It's not really preached, so to speak. So I'm wondering what you would say, kind of from your perspective, what Christianity or the traditions could bring in terms of, family, children.
Nice. So let me see. Maybe first, as a caveat, I have noticed that my instincts have caused me to studiously avoid engaging with the thing called metamodernity. So I am not a metamodern, and I don't actually know a whole lot about it. I just have a very, very deep sense that it's a bad idea, so I avoid it. I did the same thing with integral, and I felt that was a good choice. I observed it from the outside, talked to a lot of people who were part of it, but never participated in it. Okay, so as a consequence, I don't know a whole lot about it. Second, I don't know who you're getting your meta crisis news from, but yes, if they're not talking about the demographic collapse, then they are definitely missing a key piece of the story, and in many different ways, right? Because the demographic collapse is both a symptom, it is a sign, and it is a cause, right? So we've got a very powerful one to keep an eye on. Okay, third, well, come visit Western North Carolina. There is a very large number of pregnant ladies walking about right now, including my wife. There's a lot of babies. There's a lot of families that have 6, 8, 12 kids in them. Some of them are adopted. Many of them are not. You've got grandmas playing with grandkids. What you got is ordinary wholesomeness. And this is one of the things that is kind of the core code of what every religion must deliver if it is to be called a religion properly. Right? So religion is not so much about the content of a book of doctrine that is operating at the level of high theology, as much as it is about actually being able to embody that in the thriving vitality of lived relationship. And I can tell you that this is, in fact, just we call it empirically measurable. Go to really deeply committed religious communities. And by the way, it could be Orthodox Jews or Orthodox Christians. And you will in fact see that there is no demographic crisis in those communities. And I don't mean this not just in terms of fecundity. I also mean it in terms of actual relationships, that the kids have great relationships with their siblings and with their parents. And the parents have relationships with their extended family, and they spend time together. Not universally and not perfectly, but far, far better than in our degenerate secular world.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jordan. Daljit, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Artem, for hosting this, and thanks, Jordan, for showing up as you always do. So, a deep gratitude to you, honestly. And I think like this is a deeply personal thing you're sharing, which I think is really impressive. Like you didn't have to sort of reveal this, and you do, and you always show up with great integrity. So, genuine, just gratitude for that. Um, the word that stood out to me uses humility that came out, which I know is a real Christian value. And I appreciate you sharing your whole your biography in terms of all the other modalities you did flirt with. That you included astrology, and the gene keys picked my ears because I'm deeply embedded in those. And God, I would love to see your chart, and I want to know if like Jupiter IC is on Asheville in your astrocartography. But there's an interesting thing, generationally, we are the Pluto in Virgo generation. I know you and I are about the same age, so I think I can surmise we have that. And humility is our soul work to do as a collective. And so this return to Christianity seems aligned in a way. But I think for a lot of us who, when we heard that Jordan Hall, the great systems thinker, was converting to Christianity, a lot of us did that Benita Roy thing, like, what? Like it was a little dissonant. And so, and maybe to tie the integral thing in, like to me, the transcend and include part of it, which is, I guess, comes from Gebser, but not Wilbur. Like to me, that is useful as a heuristic for us in our modern times. And so my bump as someone who was raised Roman Catholic and outside of the Diocese of Boston, so that'll give you some clues of what went on in my church's area, and have a trauma around Christianity. Within the context of it is the religion of our culture, of the Americas or the West, but are just having a hard time re-engaging with it because it does not transcend and include in our experience. It says there is only one way and one way only, and if you don't accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal savior, you're going to hell. So do you bump up against that in your version of it? And do you have any advice for those of us who admire what you're doing but are having a hard time moving back to something that we, like your dad, left as soon as he left the house? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. So it feels like actually the seeds to respond to your question are contained in part of what you brought up. So yeah, I'll do this. I'll critique. Critically, we do not love well enough. So we do not love well enough. And we who say that we have chosen to follow the way of Christ must love better. And that's what we've said. That's what we've committed to. And we do not love well enough. So that is my primary critique. In the context of that, we are not humble enough. Which is to say that there is and somebody brought up left brain. There's a left-brainedness, a propositional tyranny that has taken over the church and the form of the church, to say it that way. The church is not the form of the church. The church is the actual lived relationships between and among and with, meaning between and among the people and with God. And there will always be a form of the church. And the form of the church is not the body of Christ. This is the difference, again, between propositional and participatory. But of course, we tend, and certainly the West more, and the post-Enlightenment West still more, tend to default to the things that we can make sense of, the things that we can feel like we have control over, that we can use to make distinctions, particularly systematically. And so what I would say is that we, the church, have fallen into an ideological version of what is in fact fundamentally anti-ideological. And this is a deep tragedy. And you can see it even just in the simplicity of what I mentioned earlier. And you've got your Orthodox, your Catholics, and your Protestants who are at each other's throats. When, of course, each individually has absolutely accepted the responsibility for loving each other as Christ loves them. Well, okay, so clearly we do not love well enough. And I would say that the call that we have now is to deepen our individual and collective humility tremendously, and to deepen our capacity to love vastly more deeply and more really, right? This is why I think I even ended with that as being such a signature element. Notice that none of this is articulating notions of transcend and include, which has the ambiance of an ideology. Or to put it very, very precisely, transcend and include actually is a meta move, not a transcendent move. This is the actual transcendent move, which is to move from ideology to embodiment of love. And so that's sort of the proposal I would make. To the degree to which those who profess themselves to be Christians, it was actually part of the earlier dialogue. You know, if you kind of wear the fish logo on your shirt or whatnot, what do they call them? Fish first Christians, don't actually live that to which they have committed and profess, then well, first of all, I have both the responsibility and permission to rebuke them, so I do. But those who are endeavoring to be disciples and to follow the way have a profound responsibility. And this, I can't really say a whole lot more than that. And do it, live it. And if you do, then the fruits should then be the thing that will bring attention, and people will say, wow, why is it that your children are happy? Why is it that your parents are in relationship with you? What's happening? Because I'm noticing that's not happening in my world, nor among anybody who I know. And you could say, well, this is how we're doing it, right? So working from the lived experience of wholesomeness and vitality and aliveness, right? The living water. And to the degree to which some of the words make sense and are helpful, nice, neato. That's the way I'm at least endeavoring to live it.
Yeah, I wanted to double click on like the tyranny of the propositional and how that's now embedded in churches. And I wanted to plug this one book. It's called The Religious Case Against Belief by James Carse. I'm not sure if you've read that one, Jordan, but yeah, I highly recommend that book for anybody that wants to understand religion in a different way. That's not being trapped by propositional knowing in a way. And I think Stefan is next.
Hi, Jordan.
Hi.
I've got two questions for you, if that's okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about intuition. So I wrote this down. Okay, so how much of your intuition would you estimate as background brain processing versus divine calling?
Ah, that's a fun question. I love the self-referentiality of it. Let me ask God and see what God says first. Hmm. Maybe 85-15.
Which one is 85? God?
No, brain.
85 is brain.
Yeah. It's like like think about, like use the example of a radio. How much of the music is the physicality of the radio, the antenna, the electrical system, and how much of it is the electromagnetic signal that is ultimately transformed into the music? Your speakers, like the radio, is a lot of embodied energy to be able to transmit the music to your ears. And the electromagnetic signal is actually a relatively small fraction. And my feeling is that, actually, just as a little fork, if you don't mind, one of the things that surprised me, but also enheartened me, is as I spent more time speaking to, let's say, Christians, was the degree to which there's a point that this is a religion in which the body is a fundamental. This is not a Gnostic orientation towards mind or spirit. Your body is a real critical element and non-negotiable. And by the way, when you die, your body is resurrected. So this is, you don't die and then spirit. No, die and body, spirit, right? But you continue on. And the point being that embodiment, proper embodiment, properly being able to cultivate the wholeness of your embodiment so as to allow you to be able to participate in that nuanced, intimate relationship with God is irreducible, critical, and is that which allows the divine to then speak through you.
So when you went to that church and you felt like really pulled to that, would you say that came from the 15% or the 85 or some strange mix of both?
Yeah, not strange, just mix. Like that notion of psychedelic, I think, is pretty good. So, I walk in through the door and I see people, and I'm able to be in a place of noticing, let's say, my embodiment. My embodiment affords me the ability to just notice. And so I notice it's hard to explain, like wow. I don't know if you guys notice micro expressions, but I notice micro expressions and notice the micro expressions of the teenagers talking with each other and notice, oh, that's healthy. Like there's just a genuine care going on at the basis of this conversation. And the person who's speaking is ultimately, at the end of the day, alive. Right? They may in fact be sad, but that sadness is not to the core. The sadness is happening, in context. And this is all, again, just the level of noticing. And then the divine part. The divine part is almost like certain individuals would pop forward, almost like changing the focal length, but also supernatural in the sense of, and you could say psychedelic if you'd like more information was literally available in my sensory field. Whoa, that person is, that what is a halo made of? That person is glowing. Something's going on there. I need to attend to that person. And also, by the way, here, that's not a very clean way of articulating things on a camera, is it? A sense of my inner orientation, like almost like a balance of, I'll give you an example. I am maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. Oh no, 2 weeks ago. I'm sitting, singing in worship. There's a young woman up here who's had a pretty rough time. And she's singing beautifully. And I'm just sitting there watching her, and I just have this very, very distinct sense of, and I would say God telling me, she is unspeakably beautiful. And a feeling of, oh, I need to tell her that. And so I just, afterwards just went and said, hey, I just want to let you know, God wants me to let you know that you are unspeakably beautiful and how much appreciation I have for the presence that you bring to our church when you're here. And then she lets me know that she is undergoing a variety of medical treatments and as a consequence of these medical treatments, is creating all kinds of weird effects on her body and inflammation. And she had looked at herself in the morning and had said to herself how ugly she was. All right. So notice that I wasn't thinking about that. I was just singing a song about who knows what, right? Probably Jesus. And had this very clear feeling of, hey, do this. And by the way, the truth of it, think about that. It's true. She's unspeakably beautiful. There's no question about it. And God's letting me know how beautiful that is, because I get to see that beauty. I get to participate in God's perspective of his beloved people, far beyond my capacity. And then I get to participate in his love by conveying that to her. So that would maybe be a more concrete example.
Mm-hmm. It kind of sounds like, I think of it kind of like my body becomes like a radar, like honing in on something that feels a lot like a metal detector.
Sure, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like a guitar, well tuned, well constructed, or violin if you like to go the Stradivarius direction, capable of actually holding and conveying the tune, and then it just needs to be played.
Yes, I didn't think about that one. So that was my first question. That's all right. I wanted to ask you also. I think it relates. I saw you on Peterson with Raveki, and I was wondering about the question. Like you were asked a question by Peterson that I was wondering what your updated thoughts on that were. Is when he was asking about how do you discern between an ego-driven calling and a higher good calling.
Well, okay. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to forget the part about the Peterson context because I don't remember that. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that I had the conversation, but I don't remember any of the content. Although I've seen a couple of clips. I have that, but it wasn't in there. So the question is, how do you discern between an ego-driven and a higher calling? Okay, let's see. Well, one, which isn't very helpful, is that you will find that if you're pursuing an ego-driven calling, it will hurt very badly at some point. It may be a while. It may be a while. And you may not notice it hurts until too late, but that's one. What's interesting is that the other one, a vocational calling, may be very uncomfortable early.
Mm-hmm.
But it has a characteristic of having a richness to it. So here's others, I would say. Does it connect you with the people you love most? Does it separate you from the people you love most? Because the ego is narcissistic, which means that it wants all of your attention for itself. And one of the things that it will do is it will bring you into places where it can keep that attention to itself. Whereas God is relational. And so God wants to put you into callings where you're in a position that your gifts can be given. And it has this characteristic of increasing richness of relationality. So you find yourself alienated, cut off, separated. And there's lots of ways that can happen, by the way. You know, I know a lot of rich people. I don't know any rich people who aren't alienated and cut off. Or is it something that's actually bringing you into a deeper capacity to give? And are you noticing, by the way, how does this feel? It's a little bit like heartbreak, where heartbreak and joy meet. Probably some really good word for that. When you encounter people along the dimension of your calling, of your vocation, and when you're able to interact with somebody and truly give them that which you are here on earth to give, it's not simple, right? It will tear your heart to shreds because it's a level of communication that is at the level of soul, and they are able to receive it, which is shocking. So you should have that feeling when you're called. Now, of course, the problem is in the beginning, the ego calling is more alluring. That's what it's good at. It's good at supersalience. It's good at the dopamine hit. It's good at using your understanding and trying to cut out your spirit. And so separating them out at the very beginning can be very, very tricky. And here, by the way, I would definitely kind of give a high five to our Buddhist friends, because that's a lot of really good work on being able to notice the difference between self and ego. And you know, if you've delved into that enough to be able to have a clarity on that, you'll notice, okay, I can feel the taste, the aesthetics. This is coming from ego, and can maybe steer away from it. Although be careful with that, because the ego's clever. It's more clever than you.
Yeah. It sounds like that heartbreak, and you said, was it love or joy?
Joy.
It sounds like you kind of encountered that when you told that lady she was beautiful, because it sounds like she was not feeling that. She felt ugly, and you maybe on some level even sensed it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And that's a vocational calling. In that case, God told me to say that.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks, Jordan. Good seeing
You're
you.
welcome. Yeah, I can see you too.
Thanks, Stefan. Morgan?
Hi, thank you very much for this topic. I grew up Quaker and learned a little bit about Buddhism, went to Quaker meeting and meditated. And then I connected with Jesus, and I gave my life to Jesus 25 years ago. And I think it's around the anniversary of that. I still consider myself at this point to be a Quaker and a Buddhist. And so within the Christian community, essentially I'm a heretic, which doesn't necessarily feel very good, but those types of words have been used. I also have been part of a number of churches, and I was always very politically liberal, but I wanted to just understand people and why people think and feel the way they do. So I did go to a lot of conservative churches, and I experienced a lot of amazing things. I am winding around to a question, but I just wanted to say a few things briefly, which is, my experience of the faith is that, and the Bible and my relationship with God is that it's been rich with personal growth and has really helped me as far as conceptualizing collective care. I feel like there's so many lessons from the Bible that are expressed symbolically in a way that make it very relatable. And just as one example of a insight that has arisen for me over the years is that I strongly believe that when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," that what he meant is that I am the way, that the self is the way, the self is the truth, and the self is our way to eternal life. And I don't know how different people use the word self or soul or spirit or whatever, but that I really believe that Jesus was actually a teacher very much like a Buddhist teacher, and that's really helped me to relate to and to truly understand Jesus. And I have like a supernatural relationship with him where he's been protecting me and guiding me and guarding me. And so all of that is kind of leading up to my question, which is I really strongly believe that the unfortunate thing is that I think fundamentalist Christians have kind of remade God in their own image of being homophobic, transphobic, maybe a little racism sprinkled in, and a lot of values that I don't agree with, and values that I tried to communicate with my church members about. I presently am more of a householder with my Buddhism, and I don't go to church because I cannot find a church where they preach the gospel and welcome everyone. I can find a church where they preach the gospel, but it's not open and affirming. And I can find a church where it's open and affirming, but they don't preach the gospel. And like, so for me, like the gospel is like what gives me life. And I just want to really one last point before my question, which is I really strongly believe that it's possible for our generation to reclaim the church with a full and embracing love that truly includes everyone and where everyone gets the benefit of learning the gospel and the love and the real deep love that Jesus has for us. I think that we could overcome the hate and oppression in the church. And I think that many liberals and progressives have left the church because of the hate. I think that we, my thought is we're not trying to take anyone out of the church. It's just who can we bring into the church and truly welcome. So my question for you is, how do you deal with the parts of yourself that are not welcome in the church? For an example, have also done psychedelics, but I'm not going to go to church and talk about psychedelics. I'm thinking about, embracing, community, in my community is very diverse in terms of gender identity and sexuality and many other variables. But I know people in the church who feel comfortable like looking at me with like an evil eye because I have those beliefs. So how do you deal with the parts of yourself that are not welcome in the church, and how would you recommend that the church and or other individuals, address these kind of cultural divisions?
There's a lot there. Let me see if I can tease apart three things. The first is that I would say, at least there is no variation on the Protestant church that is not intrinsically liberal. And that's a problem. That's a categorical failure. What I mean, and I mean liberal here in the fundamental sense. So our current polarization, the American left is a particular variation on liberalism. The American right is another variation on liberalism. And liberalism by its very nature is an idolatry of ego and identity, and intelligence. And what happens is that we've endeavored, everybody on the left and the right in church has endeavored to create a version of Christ that is in fact their own idolatry. And that's bad. That's not good. The second thing is I would hone in on a particular sensibility. This is certainly, and this will then step to the kind of the deeper answer to your question. As I was listening to you, the phrase that came to my mind was not open and affirming, but open and convicting. So what I notice is that I don't hide any part of myself when I come into my church right now, because I want to be convicted, because I know that I'm not perfectly right or even meaningfully right. I'm wrong about a lot. I'm a very flawed and very failed kind of being. I have lots of bad habits. I have lots of bad instincts. I have a number of character flaws. I have a tremendous number of bad ideas. And I don't want to have people give me the false sense that where I am wrong, I am right. I want the reality of reality to sink into me and allow me to attune myself to what is in fact actually true and good, because I do want to be able to love well. And the only way to love well is to be able to love from a place of being in relationship with the truth. Okay, well, of course, that doesn't mean I want people to impress upon me their own sins. That's not a very helpful process. This is the notion of me trading my false ideas for your false ideas is a very odd thing to do. So this is why I said the word conviction. Again, I have a sense of that may not be particularly well shared. It may be broadly shared. I don't know. I don't really know the world very well. But the sense that it is exactly this notion of two things. One is a very clean, clear, and deep perception of something like a reconciled relationship with God, with Christ, where that allows you to heal the location in your soul that has produced errors in your will and in your mind. And that healing is critical. The Eastern Church, I think, does a really good job on this, is that they talk about it, this whole journey is a healing journey, and we're endeavoring to heal. And we've been thrown out of the garden, is to say that we've been thrown into something like sickness, and Christ is the great healer. And so if I have something in me that is an error, and somebody else lives a different way and comes in and helps me to be convicted on that and to become more fully, more deeply capable of being in a relationship with God, that is a very, very good thing. From a point of view of humility, I don't have the ability to have a preconceived notion of what that absolutely must be. But it's very different than exchanging ideology for ideology. It's a completely different. It's not at all the same. So open, and then real, like real. You have to be really in relationship. You can't. This is not a simple thing. You can't look at a book and say this is it. You definitely can't look at a political guide and say this is it. If you're using the political, you're almost certainly wrong, because the political is designed to polarize. We all get that, right? The function of the political is to polarize. The political is designed to separate us into two highly conflicting groups that are roughly the same size. That's how our system intrinsically, the self-organizing systemic dynamics of our political system produces that as a primary consequence. And so if you're using the output of that system to produce your sense of what is real and true and good, you are definitely being pulled away from the center. However, if you find yourself in a relationship with people who are on the other side, if you happen to be on one side or the other, and you're in a relationship of love and care, which is not trivial by any stretch of the imagination, then you can begin the process of healing that division. And that's a very powerful possibility. So I know that in my church, I have spoken about the psychedelic use. Actually, I've been asked to testify 4 or 5 times. And I'm, hey, we did the polyamory thing in California. I've taken most of the psychedelics. I'm just going to share with you my experience. And by the way, I'm going to say this is actually what I said. Broadly speaking, it's probably not a good idea for you, but it might be. It was for me. I would not be here if I had not had these experiences in this order. Here's the ones I would avoid. Here's the direction I would go. Here's how not to be wildly stupid. But, broadly speaking, get your cart in order and don't think you're going to solve big problems by teleporting to the top of the mountain, looking around, teleporting back down to the bottom. Fair enough. And that might not be wise, probably isn't. And it might not be helpful. But the point is at least the best I can do in terms of earnestly conveying the truth of my experience. And if somebody else benefits from it, great. But the point I wanted to make is that's actually been invited in my church. And as Terry knows, I would say that politically, my church skews pretty far to the right. It's a pretty conservative church in a pretty conservative neck of the woods. We have a decent number of both political and theological liberals in the church, and they're perfectly part of it. But I didn't get bounced for that. So that's all I can say.
Yeah, might have to move to North Carolina, Black Mountain, to experience Jordan's church. So I see that we are at time, Jordan, to what we agreed on. Do you have to run now, or do you have a little more time for a couple of these hands?
I have time for exactly one more. I actually have committed to go hiking with a bunch of families right after this.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. So I apologize to all the questions that we didn't get to. Ben, you will be the last question.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
This actually tees up my question, which I've been trying to sort out for a while now. I just spent some time in Peru doing ayahuasca, and I've worked on the meta crisis for a while, and I like to stay informed on the current American political situation and try to find the wise way of relating to it in conversation with others, maybe in civic projects that might have some positive consequence. And so I'm curious, anything you might say about what relationship, if any, to have with the current American political situation in these contexts that we've been discussing?
Well, what I would do is I would put it in a slightly reverse order, which is to say, how do you make any choice? And then how does that cascade down to that particular choice? And I bet, by the way, this is not in the least bit, how do I say this right? I'm not kidding. I'm actually telling you the truth as far as I understand it. And this is how I'm trying to live by faith, meaning learn how to listen to God and do what he tells you to do. That is a crazy thing to say, but I'm actually, and by the way, it's what Christ said, but nobody does that. I'm trying. All right. So learn how to listen to God and do what he tells you to do. Wild. Notice, by the way, this is a categorical solution to the complexity of the meta crisis, FYI. If you want to kind of use your brain to think about it. I mean, how do I access something? How do I deal with the complexity of the meta crisis? Turns out you need infinity. But infinity's online. He wants to talk to you. You just got to learn to listen. And then, by the way, do it, which you probably won't. Okay. Well, then things actually get quite simple. If you don't have an ego calling, but you have a vocational calling to participate in the current political system in some way, then do that. I mean, it's hilarious, but it's actually correct. And what's interesting is just, oh boy, you can do the work if you want. You can do the combinatorial structure and notice that this is exactly the right answer, even though it seems absurd. And by the way, you can't even pre-configure exactly what that means. Like, what if you got a call tomorrow from Pete Hesketh? He said, Ben, for some reason, I feel like I need you to come work in the a defense intelligence agency. Well, you could think about it and probably do you do a terrible job, but you could pray on it. And if you had spent enough time to be able to humbly listen to what God wanted, and God said, yeah, Ben, I put that on Pete. You're supposed to go. Don't worry about it. I got this. This is my plan. And remember, I'm really good at this. Do it. Then you would go. And by the way, you would learn some really interesting stuff. Like, hey, I didn't understand how reality worked. I didn't understand what's going on in the DIA. I didn't understand who I am or why I'm here. Like, because you probably don't. And then you might notice that you're actually participating in things that have profound good implications in spite of your own insanity and incapability. Maybe you go, nice. What else you got for me, God? That is an absurd answer, but I got to tell you, that's where I ended up. So you could just throw it out. I could be completely wrong, but to the degree to which I'm not completely wrong, that's what I got to say.
I was going to just say, I really appreciate that. And I resonate a lot with what you shared. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Jordan, thank you so much for coming on here. Really appreciate you. There was the piece you were talking about with the lady at your church and telling her that she needs to be beautiful, that intuitive sense. Like, I've never interacted with you before, but I've met several people that had interactions with you, and they've shared these stories of like this, how you had this kind of intuitive sense to do something or reach out so it seems like there is this quality that you're tapping into, and really appreciate it. And yeah, I just want to tell everybody to flip real quick to the gallery view so we could just kind of see some of the faces, maybe some of the people that didn't get to speak. And yeah, just appreciate everybody that's come on here, and just could kind of wave to everybody. And I'm going to end the recording in a second, but I'll stay on and we can kind of keep the discussion going. I know Jordan has to go. So thank you, Jordan. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.